The Zarn Collective controlled 1/3 of the known galaxy, and it had done so for 11,000 years without interruption. A billion drones spread across 1,000 worlds, all of them connected by the same silent, seamless current of shared thought. Nothing moved in Zarn space without the collective knowing. Nothing happened on any of its worlds without the vast consciousness called the Unity processing, categorizing, and filing the information within milliseconds. It was the most complete intelligence network in the galaxy, and it had encountered nothing it could not account for. Until the signal arrived. It came without warning, on a frequency no species in the collective's extensive database had ever used. Its origin point was a region of space that all existing charts marked as empty, no stars, no planetary bodies, no infrastructure of any kind. The signal lasted exactly 3 seconds and carried almost nothing. A mathematical sequence, clean and simple, listing the prime numbers from 2 to 103. The Unity examined it for less than a second and filed it under low priority. A natural phenomenon, most likely. Perhaps a dying civilization's final automated broadcast. Nothing that required attention. One drone disagreed. Unit 7 was a deep space observer stationed at the outer edge of collective territory, and it had been the first to receive the signal. It did not feel unease, the collective did not permit feelings, but it recognized a pattern that did not fit, and it flagged the anomaly and waited. The Unity did not respond. 7 days later, the signal returned. The second signal was stronger and longer, lasting 6 seconds where the first had lasted 3. It carried more than mathematics this time. Embedded within the transmission was a simple image, a circle, bisected first by a horizontal line, then a vertical one, then 2 diagonal lines crossing through the center. A symbol constructed from division. The Unity processed it in the same unhurried way it processed everything, and arrived at an unfamiliar result. Confusion was not a state the Unity experienced often, but nothing in 11,000 years of accumulated knowledge offered a match for either the symbol or the species that might have produced it. The scout fleet dispatched to investigate was small and fast, 15 vessels, chosen for stealth rather than firepower. They arrived at the signal's origin coordinates and found precisely what the charts had always indicated was there. Nothing. Clean vacuum, undisturbed and unremarkable, offering no debris, no radiation trace, no gravitational signature to suggest anything had ever occupied that space. The sensors were functioning correctly. The emptiness was genuine. And yet something had broadcast from here, twice, with increasing clarity. The fleet commander, a specialized drone designated Command 1, was preparing his return report when the long-range array returned an unexpected contact. 800 light-years out, moving on a direct heading toward the collective's nearest border, was a fleet of unknown vessels. No identification signal. No communication of any kind. The Unity calculated the arrival time at 72 hours and issued the intercept order without hesitation. The scout fleet located the unknown vessels 12 hours into the intercept course, which meant the strangers had been moving faster than the initial trajectory calculations suggested. Command 1 brought his ships to a full stop and ran a complete sensor sweep before transmitting anything, because the data coming back from the sweep required a second pass to confirm. 40 ships, dark gray and angular, moving through the void without producing the emissions that any known propulsion system generated. No heat signature. No engine wash. No radiation of any kind. The sensors could detect their physical presence and nothing else, as though the ships existed only as shapes and had decided the rest was unnecessary. Command 1 hailed them on every available frequency and received no reply. He transmitted the standard collective warning, identify or face destruction, and received the same silence in return. The 40 ships continued their approach at the same unhurried speed, and the blockade he formed across their path appeared to register with them as nothing more than a minor feature of the local geography. When the warning shot fired across the bow of the lead vessel, every sensor on every Zarn ship updated simultaneously, and the updated positions made no physical sense. All 40 unknown ships had moved. The lead vessel was now behind the scout fleet, so were the other 39. The repositioning had taken less than a second, and no propulsion signature had accompanied it. A broadcast reached every Zarn frequency at once. One word, in perfect Zarn, spoken without inflection. Leave. Command 1 did not leave, because leaving required an order, and the order had not come. He transmitted the full sensor record to the Unity and held position, which was the only thing a drone without instructions could do. The Unity processed the footage and ran its probability calculations and arrived at numbers that were not encouraging. 15 ships against 40 vessels of unknown capability, with the 40 already demonstrating a repositioning speed that made standard tactical doctrine irrelevant. The odds did not favor engagement, but the collective had never retreated from contact with an unknown force, because retreat produced no data, and data was the foundation of everything the Unity did. A destroyed scout fleet was a loss. A destroyed scout fleet that had managed to transmit something useful before being destroyed was an acceptable cost. The Unity issued its order. Engage. Priority was data collection. Survival was secondary. Command 1 acknowledged and opened fire with everything available. Plasma cannons and missile swarms and focused energy beams all crossed the distance between the two formations and struck the dark gray hulls of the unknown ships and accomplished nothing measurable. The weapons did not deflect. They did not bounce. They arrived at the hull surfaces and simply stopped existing as threats, the energy dissipating like heat into cold air. No damage registered on any sensor. Then the mathematical sequence from the first signal returned, amplified beyond any scale the collective's instruments had been calibrated to handle. Every system on every Zarn ship went dark at once. For 3 seconds, the scout fleet existed without sensors, engines, or communication. Then the silence ended, the systems returned, and the unknown ships were gone. Command 1 sat in the recovered quiet and filed his report. "They could have destroyed us," he wrote. "They chose not to." The Unity devoted the 72 hours following the encounter to a complete analysis of everything the scout fleet had transmitted before its systems went dark. The unknown ships had left nothing behind, no debris, no residual energy signature, no physical trace of their presence in the space they had occupied. The sensor records were thorough and produced almost nothing useful. Almost. The mathematical sequence remained. The prime numbers, transmitted twice in increasing strength and used a third time as a disabling weapon, were the only consistent element across every contact the collective had experienced. The Unity ran the sequence through every encryption and decoding algorithm in its accumulated library and found no match. A junior analyst drone submitted a query that the Unity almost filtered before it fully processed the content. What if the sequence was not a message? What if it was a key? The Unity ordered a deep space scan of the original signal coordinates, a full-spectrum sweep requiring 6 hours to complete. The results required a second scan to confirm, because the first scan's output fell outside the parameters of anything in the collective's 11,000 years of documented observations. A structure occupied the empty region, ancient, massive, and constructed from materials that absorbed every frequency of conventional sensor radiation, rather than reflecting it. A ring, circular and vast enough to enclose a small moon, hanging in the void without any power source the scan could identify. And then the scan registered something new. The ring was no longer inert. It was powering up. 30 hours remained. The Unity had never asked for help. In 11,000 years of expansion across a third of the galaxy, the concept had not arisen as a serious option because the collective had never encountered a problem that could not be resolved through the application of sufficient force. The ring relay changed this calculation in a way that the Unity processed and reprocessed across multiple cycles before accepting. A defensive fleet of 10,000 ships, the largest the collective could assemble within the available time, produced a probability of successful resistance that the Unity's models rounded to negligible. Something else was needed. The signal had come from somewhere. The relay had been activated by something. The unknown fleet had not constructed a ring large enough to encompass a moon in empty space without assistance, which meant a third party existed, one with knowledge of the relay's operation and apparent interest in ensuring the collective became aware of its activation. The Unity traced the signal origin to a small star system at the galaxy's outer edge. One inhabited planet. The species designated themselves humans. Their file was brief. Deathworld classification, high gravity, persistent predator biology, faster-than-light capability achieved 2 centuries prior. Technology assessed as primitive by current Zarn standards. And yet the relay existed, and the signal had come from their direction, and the Unity had no better option available. It transmitted one question to the human planet. "Who are you?" The reply arrived within minutes. "We are the ones who turn off the lights." The Unity requested clarification and received a data file in return, large enough that processing it required several minutes even for the collective's core intelligence. The file was a history, and it began 10,000 years before humanity had developed the technology to leave their own solar system, which placed its opening events in an era when the Zarn Collective was already several thousand years into its expansion across the galaxy. The war described in the file had nearly ended the human species entirely. The enemy had arrived through relay gates from outside the galaxy, using technology so far beyond anything humanity possessed that the first contact had lasted approximately 6 weeks before most of human civilization ceased to exist. A small population survived in the ruins of what their civilization had been, and spent the following centuries doing the only thing available to them, studying the enemy's technology, because understanding it was the only possible path toward anything resembling a future. They learned how the relays operated. They learned something the enemy had never discovered. The relay network could be run in reverse. Rather than transporting invaders inward, a reversed relay could broadcast outward across the entire galaxy simultaneously, reaching systems and structures that had been dormant for millions of years. Defenses, built by a species older than the invaders and seeded across the galaxy before that species disappeared from the record entirely. Humanity had spent a century locating the master activation point. They had just used it. The Unity asked what these defenses consisted of. The response was a star chart marking every Zarn fleet base, supply depot, and shipyard in the Collective's territory, with a countdown overlaid across the image. 11 hours. The Unity's assessment of the star chart and countdown was that both were constructed to produce a specific psychological effect, rather than to convey genuine information. A species with primitive faster-than-light technology, and a single inhabited world, did not possess the capacity to threaten 11,000 years of accumulated Zarn military infrastructure, regardless of what ancient relay networks they had managed to activate. The Collective ordered its fleets to full defensive alert and began relocating the most critical assets away from the marked coordinates, which was a reasonable precaution, but it did not expect the precaution to prove necessary. 10 hours passed without incident. Then 9. Then 8. The Unity's probability assessments for genuine threat continued declining with each uneventful hour, and by the time the countdown reached 7 hours and 23 minutes, the alert status across most of the Collective had quietly downgraded itself through inaction. The pulse that arrived at that moment came from no direction in particular. It originated in the space between things, between stars, between systems, between the ordinary coordinates that the Collective's sensors were built to monitor. A low-frequency wave, similar in structure to the original mathematical sequence, but carrying an intensity that registered across every sensor in every Zarn installation simultaneously. The pulse repeated. Then again. On the fourth repetition, something answered it. They were not ships, and they were not weapons, and they moved with the patient, absolute certainty of things that had been waiting for a very long time for the correct signal. They emerged from the spaces where nothing had ever been detected and moved toward the marked coordinates and erased what they found there. Ships became empty space. Bases dissolved without debris. Within 3 hours, 40% of the Collective's military capacity had ceased to exist. The Unity sat with this and understood too late the difference between a threat and a warning. The Unity composed its message to Earth with a precision it applied to everything, stripping the transmission down to the essential content and sending it before the erasure count reached 41%. The message was brief. It contained a surrender, an acknowledgement that the Collective had no remaining options, and a request for terms. The Unity had never sent a message like it in 11,000 years of operation, and it transmitted the words into the void with something that, had it been capable of recognizing the sensation, it might have identified as shame. The human reply took 6 minutes, which accounted for the signal travel time and a small margin of deliberation on the other end. The defenses could not be stopped. The Unity read this line 3 times before processing the rest of the message. The ancient entities were autonomous. They had been built to respond to a specific signal, and to continue responding until the threat they were designed to address had been neutralized. The Zarn Collective was not that threat. It was in the path of something much older and much larger than any conflict it had ever been part of, and the warning the humans had transmitted 11 hours ago had been a genuine attempt to move it out of that path before the response arrived. The Unity calculated what full disarmament meant for a hive mind that had governed through military dominance for its entire existence, and transmitted its next decision before the calculation finished. It broadcast a full confession to every species in the galaxy, admitted to centuries of conquest and oppression, and asked for forgiveness. Then it waited. 1 hour later, the human reply arrived with a condition. The Unity transmitted the stand-down order to every Zarn vessel within 6 hours of receiving the human condition, which was the fastest the collective had ever coordinated a full military response across its entire territory. The borders opened simultaneously. Every species the collective had absorbed across 11,000 years of expansion received the same message on the same frequency at the same moment. You are free. Go where you wish. We will not stop you. The galaxy processed this in silence for a period that felt longer than it was. Then the human signal ceased, and the ancient entities drifting through Zarn space paused in the unhurried way of things that have no urgency because they have no sense of time, and settled into stillness. They did not leave. They simply waited, patient as geology, for whatever came next. The Unity sent one more message to Earth. It had no strategic purpose and no practical objective. It asked why. The collective had been moving toward human space when the signal intercepted its attention. It would have reached the human system eventually and done what it had done to every system it reached. The humans had known this. They had helped anyway. The Unity required an explanation that its existing models could not supply. The reply came back short and unadorned. We are not you, it said. We do not conquer. The defenses were built to stop invaders, and you were not invaders, you were desperate, and we gave you the only exit we had available to give. That is what protectors do. The Unity filed the message in a separate archive and labeled it wisdom, and sat for a long time with a feeling it had no existing category for. The reshaping of the galaxy took years rather than weeks, which was faster than anyone had expected and slower than the most optimistic projections had suggested. The Zarn collective did not collapse so much as exhale, releasing the 1,000 worlds it had held under unified command into a loose federation of species that were free to govern themselves and, in most cases, deeply uncertain what that meant after generations under hive-mind administration. The Unity remained, but as a council of distinct voices rather than a single directing consciousness, and it found this arrangement uncomfortable in ways it was only beginning to articulate. Humanity received the invitation to join the new federation as a founding member at the first formal council session, which was held on a neutral station because no one could agree on whose territory was appropriate for the occasion. The invitation came with questions attached, which the human ambassador answered without hesitation. Her name was Alara, and she had the particular composure of someone who had been waiting a long time for a conversation she was fully prepared to have. The ancient species that built the defenses had not been discovered by humanity, she explained. They had made a choice, across whatever span of time separated their disappearance from the galaxy's current arrangement, and the choice had been humanity. They had observed a species that had come within reach of self-destruction and had pulled back from it, and they had left the keys to the galaxy's oldest infrastructure in the keeping of the one civilization that had learned, at considerable cost, why those keys should never be used lightly. The signal had been the last option available, deployed only after every earlier option had been exhausted. She paused before finishing. Humanity had chosen to warn first, she said. That was simply the human way. The Federation's first year was not without friction, because nothing involving that many species and that much accumulated history ever moves without friction. A faction emerged within the first few months, organized and vocal, calling themselves the Restoration. Their argument was straightforward and spread efficiently across species that had reason to distrust sudden shifts in galactic power. The signal had been a fabrication. The ancient defenses were human weapons given an ancient-sounding origin story, and the Zarn defeat had been engineered from the beginning to clear the way for a new empire wearing a different name. The propaganda was not sophisticated, but it did not need to be. Fear rarely requires sophistication to travel. The Unity's council debated responses. Suppression was proposed and argued against. Silence was proposed and argued against. Alara waited for both arguments to reach their natural ends, and then offered the only option she had come prepared to discuss. Open everything, she said. Human worlds, human archives, human history including the parts that did not reflect well on anyone involved. Invite every investigator who wanted to come. Show them the flaws alongside the accomplishments, the centuries of internal conflict alongside the relay, and the ancient keys, and the decision to warn rather than simply act. Transparency was not vulnerability, she said. It was the only thing that actually worked against fear over time. The ships came from a dozen species over the following months. Their investigators walked on Earth and breathed its aggressive atmosphere and met human children playing in the same gravity that had shaped the species across millions of years of difficult evolution. They left carrying the same question between them, comparing notes on the journey home. How, they asked each other, did something this terrifying become this kind? The answer reached them gradually, assembled from the archives and the history and the long record of a species that had spent most of its existence genuinely uncertain it would survive. They had been afraid too, for a very long time. That was where the kindness had come from. The investigation ran for 6 months and produced more documentation than any similar inquiry in the Federation's short history. 19 species contributed teams. They spread across human territory with the methodical thoroughness of people who had been given a question they genuinely needed answered and unlimited access to the evidence. They walked through the preserved ruins of cities that had been destroyed in wars fought centuries before humanity left their atmosphere. They stood in museums built to commemorate species that humans had driven to extinction before understanding what extinction meant, and then built more museums to remember the lesson. They sat in hospitals and watched human physicians work, and interviewed soldiers who had fought in conflicts most of the galaxy had never heard of, and listened to children explain things with the confident simplicity that children bring to everything. The final report reached the Council and was read in the particular silence that follows something genuinely unexpected. The investigation had confirmed every element of humanity's account. The signal was authentic. The ancient defenses were exactly what the humans had described. The succession was real. But the report's conclusion was what the Council spent the most time with. Humanity was the most dangerous species in the galaxy, it stated, not through cruelty. The investigators had found very little cruelty and considerable evidence of its opposite, but through resilience. They had survived things that should have ended them and had extracted lessons from every survival. Their culture had organized itself around mercy and curiosity, and a quality the report described as stubborn hope. And if anything in the galaxy ever moved to extinguish them, the ancient defenses would be the second thing it encountered. The first would be their will. The Council voted for full membership without significant debate. The Council had prepared itself for someone impressive. The word dangerous, repeated throughout the investigation report, had created a particular expectation. Someone who moved through a room with the physical authority of a species that had spent millions of years on a death world, who carried the weight of ancient succession in their bearing and spoke with the measured confidence of a civilization that had just demonstrated it could erase 40% of the galaxy's largest military in 3 hours. Marcus walked in with a cane and took a moment to find a comfortable position at the speaker's podium before he began. He was old in the visible way, white-haired and deliberate in his movements, and he looked at the assembled representatives of 19 species with the unhurried patience of someone who had given difficult speeches before and understood that rushing them helped no one. He acknowledged the report directly. Everything it said about humanity was true, he told them. The danger was real. The will was real. The capacity to erase a threat when a threat became existential was not a capability humanity had acquired by accident, and they had no intention of pretending otherwise. But the report had captured one half of the truth and missed the other. He took a sip of water and let the pause do its work. The other half, he said, was fear. Every human carried it. Fear of the dark, of loss, of the people they loved ceasing to exist. The defenses had been built from that fear, aimed outward so it could not turn inward. They were survivors, he said, and survivors understood something that pure power never learned, that the only way to truly survive was to make sure the people around you survived as well. They had not come to lead. They had come to help. The applause, when it came, was the kind that builds from a few delegates and reaches the whole room before anyone decides to join it. The years that followed moved with the particular quality of time during which things are being built rather than destroyed, slower to notice in the moment, visible only when you look back across a sufficient distance. The Federation expanded, adding members through negotiation and patient diplomatic work rather than the absorption the Zarn had practiced, and the difference in the result was apparent in the texture of the new members' participation. They arrived with opinions and kept them. The species that had spent generations under Zarn administration took longer, because the work of rebuilding a culture that has been subsumed into a hive mind is not straightforward, and the humans did not pretend otherwise or offer timelines that the actual work would not support. They sent teachers and engineers and doctors and musicians, and they stayed until they were no longer needed, and sometimes longer than that because friendships developed and proved difficult to schedule an ending for. A poet from the Veth, a species that had discovered, in its first decades of freedom, a particular gift for condensing large things into small ones, wrote a verse that crossed every language barrier the translation networks encountered and arrived intact on the other side. It described a species with fire in their eyes who carried no weapons except tears, who had taught the galaxy that strength lived not in steel or authority, but in the refusal to stop moving when everything argued for stopping. Humans heard the verse and wept, which surprised the Veth poet considerably and pleased her. Ilara heard it in her garden on the Xylos' home world, old enough now that the walk to her chair had become a considered undertaking, and sat with it for a long time before she said anything. "We did it," she whispered. "We finally did it." The ancient defenses had not been seeded across the galaxy as a response to the Zarn Collective. They had not been built for any of the conflicts the Federation's member species had records of, or for any of the wars that had reshaped galactic borders across the last several thousand years. They had been built for something that had happened millions of years before those records began, and for something that the species who built them had understood might happen again, and for that reason had been constructed to last rather than to win quickly. Far beyond the galactic rim, in the cold dark between one galaxy and the next, the activation of the defenses had registered as a signal. Not the signal humanity had broadcast, something older, something woven into the physics of the defensive network itself, a consequence of the system returning to active status after millions of years of dormancy. The fleet that received it was older than the stars currently burning in the galaxy's spiral arms, crewed by the same entities that had built the original relay network and had nearly completed what they came to finish before the ancient defenders had stopped them. They had been patient. Patience across millions of years was simply what they were. They changed course without urgency toward the source of the activation. Not toward the relay, not toward the defenses, toward whoever had turned them on. The Federation's long-range detection systems registered the approaching fleet 5 years after the signal, moving at speeds that should not have been achievable and heading without deviation toward Earth. The Council contacted Marcus, who was older now and still walking with his cane and still, apparently, the right person to ask. His answer was brief and came without hesitation. They would do what they had always done, he said. He activated the ancient defenses and did not prepare a warning, because some conversations had already happened, and this was not one that needed to begin with words. The fleet that arrived at the galactic rim was not built from metal or composite alloy, or any material the Federation's sensors had a name for. The 50,000 ships were grown, each one a living organism with a hull that expanded and contracted in slow rhythmic pulses, like something breathing. They moved through space the way creatures move through water, not in formation exactly, but with the fluid coordination of a school of fish that shares one nervous system. They had crossed the void between galaxies at speeds that the Federation's physicists would spend years trying to account for, and they had arrived without announcing themselves because announcement had never been necessary before. The message from the Shepherd reached Earth on a frequency that bypassed every communications relay in the Federation network, arriving directly and simultaneously on every human receiver, as though distance were a convention the enemy had chosen not to observe. The terms were simple. The Master Control surrendered without condition. In exchange, the human species would be permitted to continue existing in a reduced capacity. Resistance would result in erasure. The Shepherd presented this not as a threat, but as an explanation of how things were going to proceed. The Federation Council convened within the hour. The debate was genuine, and the fear behind it was genuine, and both deserved the time they received. Marcus waited, and when the room had finished, he stood with the particular slowness of someone whose body has aged past the pace his mind still preferred. He looked at the council with eyes that were tired and kind in equal measure. Every empire that had ever aimed itself at humanity was gone now, he said. Humanity was still here. He turned to face the transmission. No, he said. The ancient defenses heard it and answered. The defenses did not engage the enemy fleet on conventional terms, because the entities that had designed them had understood something about this particular enemy that conventional terms could not address. The response they had prepared was not a weapon in any sense the Shepherd's tactical systems were calibrated to evaluate. A relay opened, not one of the enemy's original gates, but something older, built before the enemy's network existed, from blueprints encoded in the Master Control that no one had opened until now. The gateway was large enough to dwarf anything the Shepherd had ever constructed, and what came through it moved in silence. The crystalline ships were not alive and not mechanical, occupying some third category that the Federation's observers would debate for years without resolution. They were luminous in a way that did not depend on any external light source, and their surfaces shifted through geometries that suggested depth beyond their physical dimensions. They moved into formation around the enemy fleet without speed or urgency, as though the outcome had already been determined and the movement was simply a formality. The Shepherd recognized them. Its transmission conveyed something that would have been disbelief in any species that experienced disbelief, because these ships should not have existed. The species that built them was extinct. The crystalline ships offered no response. Instead, they broadcast something that was not a signal in any technical sense, a feeling, transmitted directly, bypassing translation and language entirely. The memory of the last war, carried in full fidelity across millions of years, arrived in the nervous systems of 50,000 living ships all at once. The hulls recoiled. The formation fragmented. The Shepherd issued orders into a fleet that had already stopped listening. The crystalline ships had not fired a single weapon. They had simply remembered, and the enemy could not endure being the subject of that memory. 50,000 ships turned and ran. The Shepherd's final transmission contained one word. Marcus answered for everyone. "Because we do not forget," he said. The enemy fleet did not decelerate at the galactic rim. It crossed into the void between galaxies at full speed and continued without any indication that it intended to stop, moving away from the Milky Way on a trajectory that the Federation's long-range sensors tracked until the distance exceeded detection range. The Shepherd sent one more transmission before the signal degraded beyond recovery. It asked what humanity was. Marcus took his time composing the answer, which he delivered in the measured cadence of someone who understood they were speaking for more than themselves. He said humanity was the species that remembered. The builders of the crystalline ships and the ancient defenses and the relay network were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but their memory had not been lost because it had been entrusted to a civilization that treated the things it was given the responsibility of keeping. Humanity was their voice and their record, and, when circumstances required it, the instrument of the consequences they had prepared for exactly this outcome. And humanity was also, he said, their mercy. The enemy had fled. That was enough. There would be no pursuit. The relay closed. The crystalline ships returned through the gateway, and the gateway sealed behind them. The ancient defenses powered down into their long patient waiting state, ready and dormant and present in the dark. Marcus sat down in the council chamber with the careful movement of someone whose 3 sleepless days had reached their conclusion. The trembling in his hands was visible, and he did not try to conceal it. He told the council it was over, and then, after a pause that carried everything the qualifier needed to carry, he added, "For now." He was smiling when he said it. The galaxy celebrated the way galaxies celebrate when something that has been feared for longer than recorded history retreats into the dark and does not immediately return. 1,000 worlds held festivals. The crystalline ships were painted on walls and woven into textiles and described in songs that tried to capture what luminous and ancient and silent looked like when all 3 occupied the same image. Marcus's single word was reproduced on every medium available until it became less a word than a symbol, and the Shepherd's flight was retold so many times and in so many forms that the details began to accumulate embellishments that the actual participants would not have recognized. Humanity held quiet ceremonies. They lit candles in small groups and in private spaces, and did not explain to the celebrating galaxy what the candles were for, because the explanation was for themselves rather than for anyone watching. The dead they were remembering had not died in the battle just concluded. They had died long before it, in the wars and the extinctions and the dark centuries when the species had not been certain it would reach the next generation, let alone the Galactic Council. The sacrifice was old, and the debt to it was permanent, and the appropriate response to a victory built on that foundation was not celebration but acknowledgement. Elara gave the speech in the council chamber standing, because she had decided the occasion required it regardless of what her legs preferred. She said that the living stood on mountains built from the dead, and that was not a source of pride but of humility, and the difference between the two was something worth understanding. The council adopted the tradition before the session ended, 1 candle, every year, on the anniversary of the signal, for the fallen rather than the victorious. The member species of the Federation lit their first candles that evening, following the human example without fully understanding it yet, and the light that filled the chamber was quiet and warm and felt, to everyone present, like something more lasting than any victory. The ocean planet had no name in the Federation registry, only a coordinate designation that Marcus had never bothered to learn. He called it home, which was sufficient. The house sat on a low coastal rise where the wind came in off the water without obstruction, and he had arranged the furniture so that every room had a view of the waves. He had lived with urgency for so long that the absence of it felt, in the first weeks, like a kind of vertigo. Then the vertigo passed and the silence settled in, and he found he had been missing it for longer than he had known. The ancient defenses were dormant, but dormant did not mean absent. Late at night, when the wind dropped and the waves quieted to a low, consistent rhythm, Marcus could feel them at the edge of awareness, not threatening, not communicating, simply present in the way that very old things are present, with the weight of everything they had witnessed accumulated in them like sediment. He wondered sometimes if they experienced anything. He wondered if they remembered the hands that had built them. Kayla arrived on an unremarkable afternoon with a recording device and the particular focused energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to ask her questions. She was young and thorough, and she asked about the builders with the directness of someone who had already read everything written on the subject and found it insufficient. Marcus sat with the question longer than she expected before answering. "They were like us," he said finally, afraid and hopeful and determined to leave something behind that would matter after they were gone. They built the defenses for someone else because they already knew they would not be there to use them. He paused. He hoped they had known their sacrifice reached its destination. "That was all any of us could hope for," he said. Kayla stayed a week, which extended to 2 when it became clear that Marcus's answers generated more questions rather than fewer, which she considered a sign of a productive interview, and he considered a sign of good company. They talked through the mornings over tea and walked the coastal paths in the afternoons when the weather permitted, and she recorded everything with the conscientiousness of someone who understood she was collecting something that would not be available indefinitely. She saved her final question for the last evening, when the light was low and the waves were doing the steady, patient work they did regardless of what was happening on the shore. She asked if he was afraid of what came next. Not what came next for the Federation or the galaxy or the ancient defenses still humming somewhere in the dark between stars. What came next for everything. For the long future that would arrive after all of them were gone. Marcus was quiet long enough that the waves filled several of the spaces where words might have been. Then he said yes, simply and without qualification. There would always be something new arriving in the dark, he said. Another force that needed to be met, another crisis that needed to be endured, another long night that would have to be waited out before whatever came after it could be reached. But fear had never been the end of any story he knew. It was the part at the beginning, before the preparation and the protection and the love that made the preparation worth doing. Kayla asked if the fear ever stopped. He shook his head. It changed, he said, from a chain into a compass. The death world had given humanity that millions of years of learning to carry fear without being carried by it, until it became the thing that pointed them toward what mattered rather than away from what threatened. That was why they were still here. Kayla wrote down every word. The book took Kayla 3 years to write, which she considered too long, and her publisher considered remarkably fast given the scope of what she was attempting. She titled it after humanity's first transmission to the Zarn Collective, because that phrase had stayed with her since she first encountered it in the archive, and she had never found a better summary of what the story was actually about. The Ones Who Turn Off the Lights. It went to press in a standard Federation edition and 17 simultaneous translations, and the demand for additional languages arrived before the initial print run had finished distribution. The passage that spread furthest was not the history of the ancient builders, or the account of the shepherd's retreat, or even the full story of the signal and its consequences. It was the paragraph she had written from Marcus's words on the last evening of her visit. She had tried many arrangements before settling on the one that made it onto the page. "Fear is a compass," she wrote. "It points toward what we love." The humans had not defeated it or transcended it or resolved it through any particular wisdom. They had learned to listen to it, and in listening had found that it consistently indicated the direction of the things worth protecting. The walls they built from that fear were not walls of exclusion but of care, and they had always included a door for anyone willing to approach without malice. Children read it in schools across 100 species. Soldiers kept copies. Politicians referenced it in chambers where decisions were being made about what kind of galaxy the Federation intended to build. The ancient defenses remained dormant in the dark, but the species that knew they were there had stopped experiencing that knowledge as dread. It felt instead like the awareness of a kept promise, someone watching, someone ready. The darkness not empty but occupied by something patient and permanent and on their side. Many years after the ocean planet had been formally named in Marcus's honor, and many more after the last human, who remembered the signal, had passed into the record alongside the builders and the billions of others who had made the long story possible, a child stood on a hill overlooking the coast where the house had been. The house itself was a museum now, preserved with the careful attention that species give to the places where things were said that turned out to matter. The child was Veth, from the species whose poet had first put humanity's quality into verse, and she had persuaded her mother to bring her here on the strength of an argument that had taken most of a long journey to fully develop. The ocean was doing what it had always done. The wind moved across the grass of the hill without asking anyone's permission. Somewhere in the dark between the stars visible above the horizon, the ancient defenses waited in their long dormancy, patient as they had always been, present in the way that very old promises are present even after the ones who made them are gone. The child's mother asked why she had needed to come here specifically. The child looked at the sky for a moment before answering. The humans were gone, she said, but the things they had left behind were not. The story was still here. The defenses were still here. The reason to keep going was still here, which was the most important thing they had left because it was the thing that made all the other things possible. She took out a small notebook, the physical kind, the kind she had started carrying after reading Kayla's book for the third time. She was going to write a new verse, she told her mother, about fear and hope and the Deathworlders who had looked at the darkest nights their history contained and concluded that the darkness was proportional evidence of the brightness available. Somewhere in the deep between stars, the ancient defenses registered the child's presence the way they registered all life in the galaxy they had been built to protect, quietly, without announcement, with the steady undemonstrative attention of something that had made a very long promise and intended to keep it.